So if you saw the last video, you'll know I completely obliterated my controller because I tried to hook it up so I could connect to its web interface, but apparently I didn't know what I was doing because like something blew up. I don't know. I don't think it was me, but yeah, so it blew up. So I went out and bought another controller, and I've been trying to look up how can I connect to its user interface because I have no idea apparently what I'm doing. And someone said I need to improve my networking skills. So I went and took the controller to lunch. It didn't end so well. So you got any hobbies? I honestly have absolutely no idea what I'm doing wrong. Hey everyone, thanks for watching How To Pixel. And in today's video, we have another episode coming from the Light Show Networking with Nick series. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about how to connect to a Pixel controller for the first time. If this is your first time tuning into the series, welcome. My name is Nick. You probably would have never guessed. The title totally doesn't have my name in it. In this series, I'm talking about everything involved with a light show and networking to make all the computers and controllers work that control our light displays, whether it be for Christmas, Halloween, whatever display you have. This series is about how you get the network to work for all of the lights to work. In the first episode, we went over what the basics of networking are, what IP addresses are, gateways, all of that stuff. And then in the last episode, we talked about how to connect to a Raspberry Pi for the first time. If you don't know what a Raspberry Pi is, it's basically just a little computer built into this board, and a lot of people use these to control their light shows. Well, in the last episode, I also wanted to include how you connect to a controller for the first time, but the episode was already over 30 minutes long, and I didn't want to add that in to make it a super long video. So if you didn't watch the last episode, I recommend you at least watch that before you continue on with this, because there's a little bit of information you'll need so you understand what we're going to be doing in this video. But yeah, the goal of this episode is to talk about how you connect to the user interface of your Pixel controller for the first time when you hook it up. It doesn't matter what type of Pixel controller you have. I only have Falcon controllers, but as long as you know your controller has a user interface, something you can access, then this tutorial should work about the same for you. Now, before we move on with that, I want to talk about something I missed in the last episode that I want to tell everyone about, because this is a real lifesaver and I cannot believe I forgot to add this. I'd like to thank the person that left this comment on the screen right now. They recommended, instead of having to go onto your router to find the IP address of your Raspberry Pi or controller, that you use FPP Connect within Xlights. I completely forgot this is a thing, and here's why. The first year I made a light show, I'm pretty sure FPP Connect didn't exist yet, so I had to go onto my router and do all the things that I did in the last video to find the IP address of my Pixel controller and my Raspberry Pi for the first time. Well, Xlights has this super awesome tool now called FPP Connect that you can use to upload all of your sequence files, all of your media files. I think you can even upload controller information. But a really neat thing it does is it searches your entire home network for any Raspberry Pis or Pixel controllers, and it shows the IP address of it right there. It saves so much time so you don't have to go and find the IP address of your router, then go on the router and find the IP address of your Raspberry Pi. As long as whatever computer you're running Xlights on is on the same home network as your Pixel controller or your Raspberry Pi, it should be able to detect that. So before we move on with the controllers, I'm going to give a quick brief tutorial on how to use FPP Connect to connect to your Raspberry Pi for the first time, since I forgot about that in the last video. So the first steps are super simple. It's just like I explained in the last video. You'll need a Raspberry Pi, and you'll need the software called FPP or Falcon Player in it. I have the software right here on an SD card, and I reformatted it from the last video, so this is a brand new SD card. With FPP, it hasn't been booted up or anything. You'll want to insert that to the SD card slot of the Raspberry Pi, if I can do it, how to do it while on camera. There we go. And then you'll want to hook up the Raspberry Pi with an Ethernet connection to your router. Now, using FPP Connect only works with the first method that I explained in the last video. If you use the Wi-Fi hotspot, it doesn't work the same way and it won't automatically detect it. But that's okay because with the hotspot, we already know the IP address. So I'm just going to plug this end of the Ethernet cable in like that. And then I'm going to plug the other end into my router. And then you can take the Raspberry Pi power supply and plug that in. And I will do that now. And the Raspberry Pi now has power. And we should get some flashing lights on the front. There we go. Ethernet's connected. And now let me take you over to my computer to show you how you can connect to it with FPP Connect. So it is super simple. All you need to do is open up Xlights. I have Xlights open right here. You don't have to have any controllers or anything set up within Xlights. The tool will still work no matter what. You want to go up here to all of the menus, and you want to go to the Tools menu, and then you want to come down here to FPP Connect. If you click that, it'll say Discovering FPP Instances. Give it a second to load, and then it opens up this window. The first thing you could see down here is all of the sequences I've ever made. It will show every single one of them. I have a whole bunch of sequences here. And then up here, it will show you all of the devices you have on your network. And if you look, it says FPP, and then it shows the IP address. This is the FPP that we just plugged in. This is that Raspberry Pi. It scanned the home network, and it found it, and then it shows it here. Now, like I said, this will only work if your computer is on the same network as your Lightshow devices. So what this window is used for is you can select all of the files you want down here, and then you can click upload right here, and it will send all those files to the Raspberry Pi so you don't have to manually upload them. But it's also useful because it gives us the IP address, and we don't have to go look on the router. I honestly cannot believe I forgot about this feature, but it is super useful. It gives us information about it too, so we know which one it is. Like, it gives us the version, the mode it's in, and if we had a host name set for it, it would show up here. But now all you literally have to do is click this, give it a second, and it'll literally open the window. That's it. You don't have to go on your router. You don't have to do any of that. It brought us right to the FPP initial setup because I've never booted this up before, and it's that simple. So now you can go back to the last video to follow the instructions once you connect to it to set a static IP address. But that's the quick tutorial. Now back to the main part of this video. So now that that's out of the way, let's talk about how you connect to a Pixel controller for the first time. Connecting to a Pixel controller is almost like connecting to a Raspberry Pi. There are some differences, but most Pixel controllers have a web interface like Falcon Player does, where you can get the IP address, type it into a browser, and then access all the settings on here. Now, I think there are some Pixel controllers that don't have a user interface, so you might want to look that up. But for my controllers, the Falcons, they have an interface, and most of the popular controllers have a web interface to access. The only difference with connecting to Pixel controllers is in their default mode, most Pixel controllers do not have any Wi-Fi interfaces. So to connect to it, you have to use Ethernet. Now, there are some Pixel controllers that have a Wi-Fi interface you can use, but they're not the best. My F16V5 has Wi-Fi in it, and I'll show that. And my F16V3 technically has Wi-Fi in it, but you can't use it. I'll explain that later. But now for every single Pixel controller out there, when you're sending the data to it, that it then converts to send to the pixels, that data must be sent over Ethernet. No matter if it even has Wi-Fi, you cannot use Wi-Fi because there's so much data that is being sent to the lights, so you have to have that come in through Ethernet. That is if you're sending the Pixel controller data. There are some modes like Master, Standalone, and Remote, which I'll make a video about sometime in the future. But for those, you don't send the controller any data. The data is already on the controller. But that's going to be for a separate video. I just wanted to let everyone know about how you have to almost always connect to these Pixel controllers with Ethernet. So now, how do you connect to one of these Pixel controllers? Well, if your controller has a web interface, you do basically the same thing you did with a Raspberry Pi. You plug in an Ethernet cable into the network ports. It's very important that you use the network ports. If you look at most Pixel controllers, there are a lot of different ports that look like Ethernet ports. On my F16V3, you can see these look like Ethernet ports too, but they are technically not Ethernet ports. Most controllers have what are called RJ45 connectors on them, or RJ45 jacks, and they look like Ethernet ports, and they take an Ethernet cable, but they don't use Ethernet data. These are used for connecting smart differential receivers, DMX items, and a whole bunch of other things. So you want to make sure that you find the Ethernet ports that are labeled network. You can see here that these say, let me see if I can get the focus, ETH1 and ETH0. That signifies that these are the Ethernet ports. And then on my F16V5, you can see that these ones even say network right underneath them, if I can get that to focus. So you want to make sure that you look at the manual of the controller or figure out what the Ethernet ports are, because if you plug in the Ethernet cable that's connected to a network into the wrong Ethernet ports, you could damage the controller. Another thing you'll notice on a lot of Pixel controllers is there are usually two network Ethernet ports. And what those are for is that way you can daisy chain multiple controllers off of one Ethernet cable. So I could have one Ethernet cable coming from my router, plug in to, let's say, this Ethernet port, and then out of this Ethernet port, I could have another Ethernet cable going to my other controller. That way I don't have to have two Ethernet cables coming from my router. The Ethernet ports almost act as a network switch that just only have two Ethernet ports. You can use either one of these though when you're connecting them to your router, and once it's connected to your router, you can boot up the controller, and then there are a couple of different ways to find the IP address to go onto the web interface. You could do like I talked about in the last video, where you go on your router, look through the device lists, and you should see the name of your controller. Mine shows up as F16V5, but that way can be a little bit complicated. Like I explained at the beginning of this video, you have to go on your router, go find all the information for it. The other way is there are a lot of Pixel controllers that have this little tiny display on it. I think it's like 1.8 inches. All I know is it's really small, but it does display a lot of information on here. And when you boot up the controller, the screen always shows the IP address the controller has. So you don't really have to go look for any IP address. If your controller has a display and it shows the IP address, it'll just show it right there, and that's super easy. You already have the IP address. My F16V3 even has a display on it, and it works the same way. It shows an IP address when it's connected, and that way you don't have to go and find the IP address. But if your controller does not have a display and you don't want to go on your router to find what the IP address of the controller is, there's one final fancy tool called Xscanner that I will show later on in this video. Now, one final thing I want to talk about before we hook these up and give them power. You might be wondering, hey, can I use the method that you talked about in the last video with the Raspberry Pi, where instead of using an Ethernet cable, you use the Wi-Fi hotspot to connect to it? Well, almost every Pixel controller does not have a Wi-Fi hotspot mode yet. I know that my F16V5 does have one, but it's been a little glitchy and I haven't gotten it to work. Using Wi-Fi hotspots with Pixel controllers is a little bit of a new thing, so a lot of Pixel controllers don't have them, and if they do, it doesn't really work the best because it's brand new, so they're still trying to get everything to work on it. I've had some problems trying to get it to work. I think I've only connected to it once successfully. And the Wi-Fi chips on most Pixel controllers have a very low range. Like when I had the Pixel controller sitting right here on my desk, and then I went to connect to it from my computer that's maybe like 10 feet away, there was only 2 bars from the Wi-Fi hotspot trying to connect to it. So I'm not going to explain how to use that because not a lot of Pixel controllers have Wi-Fi hotspots, and if they do, they're not really the best right now. Now, in the last video, you'll know I talked about if you're in the middle of nowhere and you don't have a network, you can use the Raspberry Pi as a Wi-Fi hotspot. Well, the Raspberry Pi's hotspot works pretty well, and you can connect all of the controllers to that hotspot so they can communicate. And I will talk about this in a different video, but if you don't have a network and you're worrying how you're going to get this to work since the hotspots don't really work that well, you can use the Raspberry Pi's hotspot and connect everything to that. But now, let's head over and power these up and see how we can connect to them. So I'm going to boot up both of these controllers just so you have 2 examples of how this works. I'm only going to boot up one at a time though, and I'm going to start with my F16V3. I already have the power supply plugged in right here. So I'm going to take this Ethernet cable and plug this into one of the network Ethernet ports like that. This is now connected to my router because the other end is connected to my router. I got power, and now I'm going to power the Pixel controller up. Now if we give it a second to load, the screen says booting controller. And then when it first boots up, it will show an IP address of 0.0.0.0, but that's because it's still loading. Once the Wi-Fi chip flashes, like it just did, then it shows the IP address it got. Now, your controller might not have a Wi-Fi chip that will flash, yours might be different, but just give it some time for the screen to show the IP address if you have a screen. And now if you take a look at this, you'll see the screen says 192.168.1.240. So this is way easier than trying to connect to a Raspberry Pi, because if you have a screen, it already shows the IP address. So now we could go onto our computer and type in that IP address and get access to the web interface. Now I'm going to unplug this and I'm going to show how to do the same thing on the F16V5. So I have power connected and I have the Ethernet port connected, and now I'm going to power this thing up and give it a second to boot. This one, since it's newer, it boots a lot faster. And now you'll notice for the F16V5 at least, when you first boot it up, if you take a look at it, it shows 2 IP addresses. It shows one that says Wi-Fi, and it shows one that says ETH0. Now, why does it get a Wi-Fi IP address and an Ethernet IP address when we've just booted this up and never done anything to it? Well, that is because on this Pixel controller, the Wi-Fi chip automatically turns on its hotspot no matter what. So when we go into the web interface, we can disable that because it's a good idea too. That way there's not an extra thing of Wi-Fi shooting off into the air and could mess with other signals. But if you have Ethernet plugged in, the Ethernet IP address will show up and you'll see this Pixel controller got an IP address of 192.168.1.18. So if we were to open a web browser and type that in, we would be able to connect to this Pixel controller. Now, obviously, it's going to be different for all types of Pixel controllers if you have a different brand, but as long as it has the screen and can display the IP address, and you know that it has a web interface, you can type that in and get access to the controller. So now I'm going to show how I go on and set a static IP address for this. If you have a different controller, you could still follow along, but the web interface might look different for you. If you still don't have the IP address of your controller because you don't have a screen, then skip to this time on the screen to check out the part about how Xscanner works and how you can find the IP address of this. Now the process is the same way as when you connected to the Raspberry Pi. All you have to do is type in the IP address of the controller, but I'm going to say this again because it's very important that you make sure you have this correct. The device you're using to connect to your controller, so for instance my computer, since I'm using my computer right now, has to be on the same network as the Pixel controller, because if they're on different networks, typing in the IP address isn't really going to do anything. But as long as the device is on the same network, it will be able to connect. So the IP address of the F16V5, it showed 192.168.1.118. That's what it showed on the display. There's also the Wi-Fi IP address for the hotspot, but I'm not really going to talk about that because I don't recommend using it. So if we push enter, here we go. It instantly opened up the web interface of my controller. For your controller, if you have a different model, like I said, this will probably look different. But once you're on the controller, you're going to want to find the network tab. So your tabs might be at the top or on the side or something. But look for one that says something like network or along those lines of that. If you hit it, it should open up all of your network settings. What you want to do is set a static IP address like we did in the last video. That way the IP address never changes and you can always use that same IP address to reach the controller. Because this IP address could change since it's a DHCP IP address, meaning the router gave it the IP address. But if we set a static IP address, then it will never be able to change, so we'll always know where to go to access this controller. So first, since this controller has Wi-Fi things and hotspots and all that, I'm going to disable the hotspot and disable the Wi-Fi. Because since I'm not going to use it, I don't want the hotspot on and putting another Wi-Fi network in the area, because if you have a lot of Wi-Fi networks in the area, it could slow it down. But for me, if I wanted to connect the controller with Wi-Fi, here's where I could put in the SSID and password. But I'm going to go up to the wired network configuration, aka the Ethernet connection, because that's the wired connection. And I'm going to uncheck this box that says enable DHCP, because I do not want the controller to use DHCP. Then I'm going to pick an IP address that I want this controller to always use. I recommend not using the same IP address because if you do, it could cause some problems with the DHCP server, sometimes with conflicts with it trying to use that IP address. I always recommend picking something in the higher range because that's usually not in use. So I'm going to pick 250. Remember that the fourth octet for the IP address cannot be bigger than 254. If you don't understand what I mean by that, I recommend you check out the first video of this series. But now that we've picked the IP address, we can leave the gateway, subnet mask, and DNS the same. If yours still needs to be set up, if it's asking you to set it when you switched it to static, the gateway, all of this needs to be is the IP address of your router. The subnet mask is going to be 255.255.255.0. And then the DNS can also be the IP address of your router, or you could just type in 8.8.8.8. I plan on explaining the addresses more about DNS in a future video, but for now you could just set it to either of those. So once you're done, you're going to want to find the save button on your controller. For me, it's right here. And you're going to hit save and give it some time to reboot. Once it's done rebooting, if you try to refresh the page, you'll notice that it will not refresh. And that is because the old IP address no longer works. We gave it an IP address that will never change, a static one. So we need to type in that IP address we gave it. We gave it the IP address of 192.168.1.250. Oh, not 1,250, 1.250. And then if we push enter, look at that. It brings back up the controller. And now this is forever a static IP address. It will never change. The controller will always use this. So that means we can remember this IP address, write it down, and whenever we want to access the controller, we know the IP address. Now I'm going to give my controller a factory reset so I could show you how Xscanner works. Okay, so I've just given my controller a factory reset and booted it back up. And it got the IP address of 192.168.1.18 again, and it shows it on the screen. But now, what do you do if your Pixel controller does not have a screen and you don't want to go on your router to find the IP address? Well, if you have Xlights installed on your computer, you'll notice that it also comes installed with Xschedule, which is the scheduling program, and then also Xscanner. Xscanner is this very fancy tool. There's not really much to it, but if you open it, it will start to scan your entire network and find all the devices that are on the network, and then it will find out what the host name of that device is. So it shows all the IP addresses here of things that's found on my network, and then it shows the name of that. So the first one, 192.168.1.1, that's my router. If you look down here, 192.168.1.169, this is a Roku TV right here. But if you look, there's some other ones. Like right here, it says F16V3, projector, F16V5, but these all say offline. That's because these are devices I put into Xlights and I put their IP addresses in. So Xlights tries to connect to those devices, but they're not online, so it'll show offline. But if you want to find your controller, if you look, you should be able to find the name of your controller. And here it is. It says Falcon F16V5, and then some random numbers after and letters. And then it shows the IP address. Hey, look at that. That's the IP address that the screen shows. So if your Pixel controller does not have any way to tell you the IP address, you can open up Xscanner and it will scan your network and find the IP address for you. So then if we take this IP address, 192.168.1.18, and then we go into our browser and type that in, 192.168.1.18, 118, there we go. Push enter. And it will bring up the controller. Now, obviously, I didn't need to use Xscanner because I already knew what the IP address was. But if I didn't, I could use Xscanner for it. And Xscanner even works to pick up Raspberry Pis. So if you didn't want to use FPP Connect like I showed in the beginning of the video, you could also just use Xscanner. And then again, like always, you need to make sure this computer is on the same network as your Pixel controller. Otherwise, if this computer is on a different network, it's going to scan that network and it's not going to find the Pixel controller because the Pixel controller was on a different network. But that is how you can find the IP address of your Pixel controller to connect to it and set a static IP address. You can either use the screen if it has one, you could go onto your router and look through the device lists, or you could use Xscanner and come through and find the name of it and then the IP address. So I'm pretty sure that's going to conclude it for this video. Now, if you look through the progression of this series, we know the basics of networking, and we now know how to access our Raspberry Pi, find the IP address of it, and set it to a static one so it doesn't change, and how to find the IP address of our controller and set a static IP address so it doesn't change. So now, hopefully, within the upcoming episodes, I want to talk about how you can connect the Raspberry Pi and controller or controllers or Raspberry Pis, if you have multiple of them, together to make them communicate. There's lots of different ways you can connect them together with making your own light show network, using your home network, whole bunch of different ways, but I don't need to get into it into this video. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below, and I'll try to respond as soon as I can. And I think that is it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. They say love is like a Wi-Fi connection. It can be strong and unstoppable, but hard to find in certain places. But yeah, I hope you're not like my last network connection, always dropping out when things got interesting. You know what, waiter, can we get the bill?